The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that comes right before something breaks. I stood near the back wall of the grand hall, dressed in a borrowed uniform that did not fit right across the shoulders, watching a crowd of aliens I did not trust. My name is Ethan Hale, and 3 days ago I was guarding cargo crates on a rusted transport ship. Now I was standing inside the royal palace of the Velkari Empire, at the wedding of a princess I had never met, surrounded by nobles who looked at me the way you look at a stray dog that wandered into a fancy restaurant. My hand kept drifting toward my side, where a weapon should have been. It was not there. Weapons were forbidden inside the sacred hall, they told me. Ceremonial law. Old tradition. I did not like it, but nobody asked what I liked. The Velkari were tall, close to 7 feet, with pale blue skin and long limbs that moved with a strange, gliding grace. Their eyes were too large, too round, and always seemed to be studying you, weighing you, deciding if you were worth their time. Around me, hundreds of them stood in rows of shimmering fabric and polished armor, all facing the raised platform at the front of the hall, where the wedding was about to begin. I was only there because of a contract. My crew had been hired to escort a shipment of ceremonial gifts across 3 star systems, gifts meant for the royal wedding of Princess Ethera. Somewhere between the docking bay and the palace gates, someone decided the escort needed a personal guard inside the hall itself, and since I was the only one still standing after the paperwork was sorted out, that job fell to me. I was not supposed to matter. I was background, furniture with a pulse. But something felt wrong. I had spent enough years in dangerous places to trust the feeling in my chest, the tightness that showed up before trouble did. It was there now, crawling up my spine, telling me to watch the doors, watch the guards, watch the shadows near the tall stone pillars. Nobody else seemed to notice. The Velkari guards stood stiff and proud along the walls, their ceremonial spears more decoration than defense. Their eyes were fixed on the platform, waiting for the princess to appear. I kept my eyes on the crowd. A soft chime rang through the hall, and the massive doors at the far end opened. Princess Ethera stepped through, and for a moment, even I forgot to watch the shadows. She wore a gown the color of deep water, threads of silver catching the light with every step. Her skin was a lighter blue than most of the nobles around me, almost silver in the candlelight, and her eyes held a calm that did not match the tension I felt building in the room. She walked slowly down the long aisle, her chin high, her steps measured, every inch the picture of royal grace. Beside the platform stood King Draven, her father, a broad and heavy figure wrapped in deep red robes, lined with gold. His face was unreadable, carved from centuries of ruling a difficult empire. Next to him stood the groom, a prince from a rival house, thin and sharp-featured, his expression somewhere between pride and boredom. This marriage, I had been told during the journey, was not about love, it was about peace. 2 great houses, once bitter enemies, joining together to end a war that had bled both sides dry for a generation. The wedding was not just a ceremony. It was a shield against future conflict, built from vows instead of steel. I understood shields. I understood what happens when people try to break them. The princess reached the platform and turned to face her father. The priest, an old Velkari with silver markings across his face, began to speak in a slow, ceremonial tongue I did not understand. The words rolled through the hall like distant thunder, deep and solemn. My eyes moved across the crowd again. Rows of nobles, hundreds of guests, servants standing near the walls with trays of drink no one had touched yet. Everything looked normal. Everything looked calm. Except for one man near the eastern pillar, who was not watching the ceremony at all. He was Velkari, dressed like the others, blending into the crowd with practiced ease. But his eyes were not on the princess. They were on the exits. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, the same nervous rhythm I had seen in men about to do something they could not take back. I took a slow step in his direction, careful not to draw attention. My heart began to beat faster, that old familiar drum that always came before a fight. Then I saw a second man, near the western side of the hall, doing the exact same thing. Watching exits, watching guards, not the wedding. 2 was not a coincidence. 2 was a plan. I scanned harder now, ignoring the priest's echoing voice, ignoring the princess and her measured steps toward her future husband. I found a third figure near the back, standing too still, one hand tucked inside a long ceremonial sleeve where no hand should need to hide. My mouth went dry. I had no weapon. I had no rank. I had no right to interrupt a royal wedding based on a feeling. But feelings had kept me alive longer than rules ever had. I began moving through the crowd, slow and quiet, angling myself toward the center of the hall, close enough to the platform that I could reach it if something happened. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even looked at me twice. I was nothing to them. A human, an outsider wearing a uniform that did not belong to any house, any name, any bloodline that mattered. The priest's voice rose, reaching some kind of peak in the ceremony. The princess extended her hand toward the prince. Somewhere behind me, I heard a small, sharp sound. Metal sliding against metal. Quiet enough that only someone listening for it would notice. I noticed. I turned just in time to see the man near the eastern pillar pull something from his sleeve. Something small and dark. Something that caught the candlelight in a way that jewelry never does. Time did that strange thing it does right before violence, where every second stretches out long enough to notice details you never would otherwise. The way the priest's mouth stayed open mid-word, the way Princess Aethera's silver eyes had not yet turned toward the danger, the way the king's guards, frozen by decades of ceremonial law, had not moved an inch, still forbidden from drawing their weapons inside the sacred hall. Nobody else was going to move. So I did. I broke into a sprint across the polished stone floor, shoving past nobles who gasped and stumbled out of my way, their shocked voices rising into confused murmurs behind me. The man near the pillar raised his arm, the small device in his hand, aimed not at the princess, but past her, toward the king himself. I was not close enough. I knew that even as I ran. The distance between us was too great, the moment too short, and every step felt like moving through water. The priest finally noticed the disturbance and turned, his ancient face twisting into confusion, just as the assassin's arm reached full extension. I do not remember deciding what to do next. My body simply acted, years of instinct taking over where thought had run out of time. I threw myself forward, driving my shoulder into the nearest column of guards, sending two of them sprawling and creating just enough of an opening for me to close the final stretch of distance. The assassin's eyes widened as he saw me coming, a human closing ground faster than he expected, faster than anything in this hall was supposed to move. He fired. I felt the world narrow down to a single point of focus, the small dark device, the king's unmoving figure just beyond it, the princess turning too slowly, too late. And in that frozen second, I understood something that would change the rest of my life. I was the only person in this entire hall who was allowed to break the rules. I had no house, no bloodline, no ceremonial oath binding my hands. I was nothing to them. Which meant, for the first time since I walked through those palace doors, I was the only one free enough to save them. I slammed into the assassin's arm a half-second after he fired, knocking his aim wide, the small dark device releasing its charge into the ceiling instead of the king. Stone dust rained down from above as a scorch mark spread across the ancient carvings. Screams broke out across the hall, hundreds of voices rising at once, nobles scattering in every direction like startled birds. The man I had tackled twisted beneath me, stronger than his thin frame suggested, and drove an elbow into my ribs hard enough to steal the breath from my lungs. I rolled with the impact, using the momentum to put distance between us, and came up in a low stance, hands open, eyes locked on him. He reached for something else hidden in his robes. I did not wait to find out what it was. I closed the gap again before he could bring it up, catching his wrist and forcing his arm down and away from the crowd. He was fast, faster than his appearance suggested, and for a moment we grappled in a tight, brutal struggle, each of us fighting for control of his hand and whatever weapon it held. The device clattered to the floor between us, spinning once before a guard finally broke through the crowd and kicked it away. That was when I heard the second threat. Somewhere behind me, near the western pillar, the second man I had spotted earlier was moving fast, cutting through the panicking crowd toward the platform where King Draven still stood, frozen by shock, or by the same ceremonial law that had bound his guards for the entire wedding. Princess Aethera had thrown herself in front of her father, her wedding gown pooling around her feet, her arms spread wide in a desperate attempt to shield him with nothing but her own body. I did not have time to finish the fight I was already in. I drove my knee upward, catching the first assassin under the chin hard enough to send him sprawling backward into a group of fleeing nobles, and then I was running again, my legs burning, my chest heaving, every step carrying me toward the platform, where the princess stood defenseless in front of her father. The second assassin raised his weapon. I was still too far away. Guards along the walls had finally begun breaking from their frozen positions, some drawing hidden blades from beneath ceremonial robes, others simply shouting warnings that came far too late to matter. The hall had become a storm of motion and noise, and in the center of it, everything narrowed down to one simple fact. The princess was standing in the path of danger, and I was the only one close enough to change what happened next. I do not remember making the choice. There was no long moment of thought, no weighing of consequences, no calculation of risk. There was only the distance between us shrinking, my body moving faster than I thought it could, and the sudden sharp understanding that I was not going to make it in time using my legs alone. So I threw myself the rest of the way. I collided with the princess and the king together, driving all three of us down and sideways just as the second assassin fired. I felt the strike land across my back, a burning line of pain that stole the strength from my legs and sent white light flashing behind my eyes. I did not let it stop me. I twisted my body as we fell, making sure my back took the worst of it instead of either of them, and we crashed onto the platform in a tangled heap of fabric and limbs. For a moment, the world went quiet, muffled by pain and the ringing in my ears. Then the sounds of the hall came rushing back, sharper than before, shouting, the clash of blades finally being drawn, the heavy footsteps of guards rushing to surround the platform. Somewhere above me, a voice was calling my name, though I could not remember telling anyone what it was. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, ignoring the fire spreading across my back, and found Princess Ithera staring down at me with wide silver eyes, her hand pressed against my shoulder, as if she could not quite believe what had just happened. "You are hurt," she said, her voice trembling, but steady enough to cut through the chaos around us. "I'll live," I muttered, though I was not entirely sure that was true. King Draven rose slowly beside his daughter, his heavy robes torn at the shoulder, his face pale beneath his usual composed expression. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he cannot quite categorize, something that does not fit into any of the boxes his long life had built for understanding the world. Around the platform, the guards had finally caught up to the chaos, surrounding the second assassin and forcing him to the ground before he could escape into the panicking crowd. The first man I had fought lay unconscious near the eastern pillar, disarmed and restrained by three guards who looked far too relieved to have arrived after the danger had already passed. I tried to stand, and the pain across my back made the entire hall tilt sideways for a moment. Ithera's hand tightened on my shoulder, steadying me, her strength surprising for someone who looked so delicate in her wedding gown. "Do not move," she said, her voice sharper now, more commanding. "You saved my father's life. You will not fall dead on this floor because you tried to stand too quickly afterward." I managed a tired half-smile despite the pain. Wasn't planning on it. The king finally spoke, his voice deep and rough, carrying easily over the settling chaos of the hall. "Who is this human?" One of his guards, a tall Velkari with dark markings across his face, stepped forward and answered quickly, explaining my presence as part of the merchant escort that had delivered the wedding gifts 3 days earlier. The explanation sounded thin even to my own ears, a small footnote of a job that had somehow placed me at the exact center of the most important moment in the Empire's recent history. King Draven studied me for a long moment, his large eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to read something written beneath my skin. This human threw himself in front of an assassin's weapon to protect me and my daughter. It was not a question, but I answered anyway. Seemed like the right thing to do. A murmur rippled through the surviving crowd, hundreds of nobles who had witnessed the entire event unfold, watching now as their king stood face to face with the one person in the hall who had actually done something to stop it. Guards moved quickly to secure the two captured assassins, dragging them toward a side chamber, while a group of healers rushed onto the platform, their hands already glowing with some kind of medical technology I did not recognize. One of them knelt beside me, gently pressing against the wound across my back, and I gritted my teeth against a fresh wave of pain. "The wound is serious," the healer said, glancing up at the king. "He will need proper care." Ithera did not wait for her father's response. She knelt down beside me as well, ignoring the ruined state of her wedding gown, her expression fierce and focused in a way that did not match the calm, ceremonial figure who had walked down the aisle only minutes earlier. "Take him to the royal healing chambers," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Immediately, the king's eyes moved between his daughter and me, something unreadable passing behind his gaze. Whatever he was thinking, he did not share it in that moment. Instead, he nodded once, a small, heavy gesture that carried the weight of royal command. "See it done," he said. The healers moved quickly then, easing me onto some kind of hovering stretcher that rose smoothly off the ground beneath me. The pain in my back had settled into a dull, throbbing ache, made worse by exhaustion pulling at the edges of my vision. As they carried me away from the platform, I caught one last glimpse of the hall, the shattered remains of a wedding ceremony scattered across the floor, broken glass and torn fabric, and the lingering scent of scorched stone hanging in the air. Princess Euthera stood beside her father, watching me being carried away, her expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. Beside them, the prince I was supposed to have been guarding gifts for stood frozen and forgotten, his role in the entire ceremony reduced to a footnote in the chaos that had just unfolded. The last thing I heard before the healing chamber doors closed behind me was King Draven's voice, low and thoughtful, speaking to no one in particular. A human, unbound by our laws, standing where my own guards could not. I did not know yet what those words meant. I did not know that a single sentence spoken by a shaken king in the aftermath of an assassination attempt would change the entire course of my life. All I knew, as the healing chamber's soft light washed over me and the pain finally began to fade beneath whatever strange medicine the Velkari used, was that I had done what needed to be done. I closed my eyes, letting exhaustion pull me under, unaware that somewhere beyond those doors, an ancient tradition long forgotten by most of the Empire, was already stirring back to life, one that would place a burden on my shoulders far heavier than any wound I had just survived. I woke to the sound of quiet voices arguing somewhere nearby, muffled by a wall or a curtain I could not see. My back still ached, but the sharp fire of the wound had faded into something more manageable, replaced by a strange tingling warmth that told me the healers had done their work well. I opened my eyes to a ceiling made of pale stone, carved with patterns I did not recognize, and for a moment, I forgot where I was. Then the memories came rushing back. The wedding, the assassins, the weight of Princess Euthera and King Draven beneath me, as I threw us all to the ground. I sat up slowly, testing the strength in my back, and found it held. "You should not be moving yet." I turned toward the voice, and found Princess Euthera sitting in a chair beside the bed, still dressed in a simpler version of her wedding gown, the elaborate outer layers removed, leaving only the deep blue underdress that clung to her like water. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from surviving something you were not ready for. "I've had worse," I said, which was not entirely a lie. She studied me for a long moment, her large silver eyes carrying an expression I could not quite place. Curiosity, maybe. Or something closer to disbelief. "You threw yourself in front of a weapon meant to kill my father. You did not know him. You did not know me. You had no reason to risk your life for either of us." I shrugged, immediately regretting the movement as it pulled at the healing wound across my back. Seemed like the kind of thing worth doing. "That is not an answer," she said, though there was no anger in her voice, only genuine confusion, as if my logic simply did not fit into the world she understood. Before I could respond, the door to the chamber opened, and King Draven entered, flanked by 2 guards and an older Velkari woman, dressed in ceremonial robes, covered in symbols I did not recognize. The king's expression was heavy, unreadable, the same careful mask he had worn throughout the entire wedding ceremony. "Leave us," he said to the guards, who bowed and withdrew immediately. Euthera rose from her chair, but did not leave, standing instead beside her father, with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place in whatever conversation was about to happen. The older woman remained as well, her hands folded in front of her, watching me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being studied under glass. King Draven approached the bed slowly, his heavy footsteps echoing against the stone floor. He stopped a few feet away, his large eyes fixed on me, with an expression that had shifted since I last saw him, something less guarded than before. "Do you know what you did today?" he asked. "Stop someone from hurting your family," I said. "That's about the extent of my understanding." A faint sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sigh. "You do not know our laws. You do not know our traditions. And yet you acted in a way that our own laws forbade our guards from acting. Do you understand what that means?" I shook my head slowly, unsure where this conversation was heading. The older woman finally spoke, her voice steady and formal, carrying the weight of someone reciting words she had spoken many times before, even if the circumstances were new. "There exists an ancient law within our empire, one that predates even the founding of this palace. It states that any being who saves the life of the reigning monarch within the sacred hall, during a rite of royal significance, becomes bound to that monarch by an unbreakable oath. Such a being is named Shield Sworn, granted rank above the nobility, answerable only to the crown itself." I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the explanation, the part where she told me this was simply tradition, a ceremonial title with no real weight behind it. That part never came. "This law has not been invoked in over 300 years, King Draven said, his voice heavy with the weight of that history. "Most in my court believed it forgotten, a relic of a more dangerous age. But the law remains written. The law remains binding." "You're saying," I said slowly, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, "that because I stopped that assassin, I'm now bound to some kind of ancient oath?" "Yes," the older woman said simply. "For how long?" "For life," she answered, without hesitation. "The bond of Shield Sworn cannot be undone, except by the death of the one who holds it, or the death of the one they are sworn to protect." The room went quiet, the weight of her words settling over me like a physical thing. I looked between the king, the princess, and the old woman, waiting for someone to tell me this was some kind of misunderstanding, that there was a simpler explanation, a way out that did not involve binding my entire future to an alien throne I had stumbled into by accident. "I didn't ask for this," I finally said. "Few who earn the bond ever do," King Draven replied. "That is often what makes them worthy of it." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process the sheer size of what was being placed in front of me. 3 days ago, I had been a mercenary, with no ties to anyone, moving from contract to contract, answering to no one but myself, and whoever was paying me at the time. Now I was being told that a single moment of instinct, a single choice to act instead of freeze, had bound my entire future to the fate of an alien empire. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. The old woman's expression shifted, something almost sorrowful crossing her weathered features. "The bond has already been formed. It is not something that can be refused, only accepted or denied in name. To deny it while the bond remains active within you would bring a kind of suffering few have chosen to endure." "What kind of suffering?" "The old texts describe it as a slow unraveling," she said carefully, "a weakening of body and mind, as the bond seeks the acknowledgement it was never given. Some who denied the oath in ancient times lived only a handful of years afterward, wasting away from a sickness no healer could name." I let that sink in, feeling the full weight of the situation close around me like a trap I had walked into without ever seeing the edges. This was not a title I could politely decline. This was not a job I could walk away from once the contract ended. Whatever had happened to me in that hall, whatever ancient magic or biology or law bound its way into my body during that fight, it was not something I could simply refuse and continue on with my life as before. King Draven watched me carefully, reading the understanding dawning across my face. "I will not pretend this is a simple gift," he said. "The bond of Shield Sworn carries great honor, but it also carries great burden. You will be expected to protect me and my family with your life, for the remainder of your years. You will hold rank above nearly every noble in this court, which will earn you as many enemies as it does allies. Your life, as you knew it, ends here." "That's a hell of a way to phrase it," I muttered. "It is the truth," he said simply. "I owe you that much at least." Euthera stepped forward then, her expression softer than her father's, though no less serious. "You saved my life as well, Ethan Hale. Whatever burden this bond places on you, know that it is not one you carry alone. My family will not forget what you did today." I looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of the calm, distant princess I had seen walking down the aisle only hours earlier. That version of her was gone. replaced by someone far more real, someone who had nearly lost her father and had thrown herself into danger without hesitation to protect him. "I need a minute," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. King Draven nodded, understanding written across his weathered face. "Take what time you need, but know that the ceremony to formally recognize the bond must take place before the sun sets tomorrow, according to our laws. The Empire has already seen what happened today. They will need to see how their king responds to it." He turned to leave, his robes sweeping across the stone floor, but paused at the door, looking back at me one final time. For what it is worth, human, I did not expect to find such courage in a species my court has long considered beneath our attention. Perhaps it is time we reconsider that assumption. He left without waiting for a response, the old woman following close behind him, leaving me alone with Princess Ethera in the quiet of the healing chamber. She remained a moment longer, watching me with an expression I still could not fully read. "For what it's worth," she said softly, echoing her father's words. "I am glad it was you standing near that pillar today, and not one of my father's guards. I do not think anyone else in that hall would have moved fast enough." She left before I could find the right words to respond, leaving me alone with the weight of everything that had just been placed on my shoulders. I lay back against the healing bed, staring up at the carved stone ceiling, trying to make sense of how a simple cargo escort job had turned into a lifelong bond with an alien throne. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Servants I had never met dressed me in armor bearing the royal colors of the Velkari Empire, deep red and gold, fitted to my human frame in a way that felt both foreign and strangely dignified. Advisors explained the ceremony I would soon take part in, a formal recognition of the bond that had already been forged the moment I threw myself between an assassin's weapon and the king's life. I stood now at the entrance to the same grand hall where everything had begun, the shattered remains of the wedding ceremony cleared away, replaced by rows of nobles once again, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Word had spread quickly through the Empire. A human, an outsider from a species most considered beneath their notice, was about to be granted a rank above their own bloodlines, simply for being the one person unbound enough by their laws to act when it mattered most. I could feel their stares as I walked down the long aisle, the same path Princess Ethera had walked the day before, though the atmosphere could not have been more different. There was no music this time, no soft murmur of celebration. Only silence, heavy and watchful, hundreds of alien eyes following my every step. King Draven stood waiting at the platform, dressed once again in his heavy ceremonial robes, the old woman beside him holding a long ceremonial blade I did not recognize. Princess Ethera stood a step behind her father, her expression unreadable, though I caught the faintest hint of something steady and reassuring in her eyes as I approached. I reached the platform and knelt, as the advisors had instructed me the night before, feeling the cold stone press against my knee through the unfamiliar armor. The old woman began to speak, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, reciting words in the old ceremonial tongue that I did not understand, though I could feel the weight of them settling into the air around me. King Draven stepped forward, taking the ceremonial blade from her hands, and pressed the flat edge gently against each of my shoulders in turn. "Rise, Shieldsworn," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall, loud enough for every noble present to hear clearly. "Rise, and take your place at my side, bound by blood and honor, for as long as you shall live." I rose slowly, feeling the eyes of an entire empire settle onto my shoulders, the weight of a title I never asked for pressing down harder than any wound I had taken the day before. Somewhere in that crowd of hostile, curious, watchful faces, I understood that my old life, the simple existence of a mercenary moving from contract to contract, had finally and completely come to an end. Whatever came next, I would face it not as a hired sword passing through, but as something the Velkari Empire had never seen before. A human, bound to their throne, standing where their own laws had once forbidden anyone to stand. 3 weeks after the ceremony, someone tried to poison me during a formal dinner, and I did not even notice until my food began to taste faintly of copper. I set the utensil down slowly, keeping my expression calm while my mind raced through the possibilities. The dining hall was full, dozens of nobles seated along a long table, engaged in quiet conversation, none of them paying particular attention to the human sitting near the head of the table beside the king. I glanced at my plate again, at the pale sauce covering the meat, and trusted the instinct that had kept me alive through worse situations than this one. "Something wrong?" Ethera asked quietly from her seat beside me, catching the shift in my posture. "Don't eat the sauce," I said under my breath. Her eyes sharpened immediately. Years of court training, allowing her to keep her expression neutral, even as tension crept into her voice. "You are certain?" "Certain enough." She signaled quietly to a servant, who took the plate away without drawing attention from the rest of the table. Later that night, palace healers confirmed what my instincts had already told me. The sauce contained a slow-acting poison, one that would have taken hours to show symptoms, plenty of time for whoever poisoned it to establish an alibi far from the dining hall. This was not the first attempt since the wedding, and I understood by now that it would not be the last. Becoming Shieldsworn had granted me a rank above nearly every noble in the Empire, second only to the royal family itself. It had also made me a target for every faction within the court who resented a human holding such power, and there were more of those factions than I had expected when I first knelt on that ceremonial stone. The nobles who accepted my new position were rare, and even they treated me with a wary distance, unsure how to categorize a species they had spent generations dismissing as unworthy of true consideration. The nobles who resented my position were far more numerous, and far more dangerous, hiding their contempt behind polite smiles and careful words, while working in the shadows to undo what the king's law had bound. King Draven called me to his private chambers the morning after the poisoning attempt, his expression grim, as he paced slowly across the polished floor. "This is the fourth attempt in 3 weeks," he said, not bothering with formal greetings. "Whoever is behind this grows bolder each time." "Any idea who?" I asked. "Suspicion, but no proof." He stopped pacing and turned to face me fully. "There exists a coalition among certain noble houses, those who lost the most when the war between our empire and the rival house ended through my daughter's marriage. Peace was profitable for many, but it stripped others of the power and wealth that conflict once provided them. So they want the war back. They want the world as it was before," he said, "and they see you as the clearest symbol of how much has changed. A human, granted rank above bloodlines centuries old, simply because he acted where our own laws forbade action. To them, you represent everything wrong with what this peace has cost them." I crossed my arms, thinking through the implications. If they can't touch you directly, and they can't touch Ethera without breaking the marriage alliance entirely, that leaves me as the easiest target. "Precisely," the king said. "Remove the Shieldsworn, and you remove the symbol of humanity's unexpected rise within our court. It sends a message to every other species watching our empire from beyond our borders. It says that even a bond sworn by ancient law can be broken, if enough pressure is applied." I spent the following days moving carefully through the palace, more alert than I had been even during the wedding itself. Every meal was tested before I touched it. Every hallway I walked through, I studied for shadows that lingered too long, faces that watched too closely. The training I had built over years of dangerous contracts served me well, though the constant vigilance wore on me in ways physical combat never had. Ethera began spending more time near me during this period, not out of obligation, but out of what felt increasingly like genuine concern. She was sharp, far sharper than the calm, ceremonial figure I had first seen walking down the aisle. She understood the political currents of her father's court better than most of his advisors, and she used that understanding to help me identify which nobles might be involved in the growing threat against me. "There is a name that keeps appearing at the edges of every incident," she told me one evening, as we walked together through one of the palace's quieter gardens, the twin moons of the Velkari homeworld casting pale light across the carefully arranged stone paths. "Lord Kaeth Saravan. His house lost the most territory when the war ended. He has never openly opposed the marriage, but his silence on the matter has always felt calculated rather than genuine. You think he's the one organizing this?" "I think he is the one with the most reason to want it," she said carefully. "Proof is a different matter entirely." I turned the name over in my mind, filing it away, alongside everything else I had learned since becoming bound to this strange, dangerous court. What happens if we find proof? Then my father can act against him openly, without appearing to strike at a noble house without cause. Until then, Our hands remain tied by the same laws that bind everything else in this empire. I found the irony almost amusing, in a grim sort of way. The very laws that had bound me to this throne, granting me a position I never asked for, were the same laws now preventing the king from moving against the man most likely trying to end my life. The days that followed brought more careful, quiet investigation than open confrontation. Ithra and I worked together, gathering pieces of information from servants loyal to the crown, from guards who noticed unusual patterns among certain noble houses, from merchants who had overheard conversations in the lower districts of the capital city that hinted at something larger than simple political resentment. What we found was more troubling than either of us expected. Lord Saravan was not acting alone. He had built a coalition among several noble houses, all bound by shared resentment over the peace that had ended the war, all willing to work together toward a single, dangerous goal. They were not simply trying to remove me from my position as Shieldsworn. They were planning something far larger, an attempt to break the marriage alliance itself and reignite the conflict that had bled both empires for a generation. If they succeed, Ithera said quietly, as we reviewed the evidence we had gathered late one night in her private study, the peace my marriage was meant to secure collapses entirely. Thousands would die in the conflict that follows. Perhaps more, given how much both sides have rebuilt their forces since the last war ended. And they think removing me is the first step toward that. You are the most visible symbol of change within this court, she said. Remove the symbol, and you weaken the foundation beneath everything my father has built since the ceasefire began. I looked at the evidence spread across her desk, scattered reports and testimonies that painted a picture far more dangerous than a handful of assassination attempts against a single human. This was not simply about me anymore. This was about an empire standing at the edge of returning to war, held back only by a fragile peace that certain powerful men were determined to destroy. We need proof strong enough for your father to act, I said. We need more than that, Ithera replied, her voice carrying a weight I had not heard from her before. We need to know how far they are willing to go, and how soon they intend to act. Lord Saravan is patient, but patience has limits, especially among men who feel time slipping away from their cause. That answer came sooner than either of us expected. 3 nights later, a servant loyal to the crown arrived at my chambers in the middle of the night, breathless and pale, carrying news that confirmed our worst fears. Lord Saravan's coalition had moved beyond quiet political maneuvering. They had begun gathering forces, quietly, carefully, positioning them near the capital under the guise of routine military rotation. They were not simply planning to remove me from my position anymore. They were planning to strike directly at the palace itself, during the honeymoon celebrations scheduled to take place at the royal estate outside the capital, a period when security would be relaxed and the royal family would be gathered together in one place, vulnerable in a way they rarely allowed themselves to be. I stood in my chambers, staring at the servant's report, feeling the weight of everything that had happened since I first stepped into that grand hall for a wedding I was never meant to attend settle fully onto my shoulders. This was no longer about surviving quiet assassination attempts hidden behind polite court smiles. This was about to become a war, fought not in shadows and whispered threats, but in the open, with lives hanging in the balance far beyond my own. I sent word to King Draven immediately, and within the hour, I stood once again in his private chambers, Ithera beside me, the weight of the coming storm settling heavily over all 3 of us. How much time do we have? The king asked, his voice steady despite the grim news. 3 days, I said. Maybe less. He was quiet for a long moment, his large eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the chamber walls, weighing decisions that would determine the fate of thousands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him. Then we prepare, he said, and we do not fail. I looked between the king and his daughter, understanding fully, for the first time, exactly what my role in this court had become. I was not simply a bodyguard, bound by ancient law. I was about to become the last line of defense, standing between a fragile peace and a war that would cost more lives than I could bear to imagine. Whatever training, whatever instinct, whatever stubborn refusal to freeze had brought me to this point, I would need all of it, and more, in the days that followed. The Coalition believed removing a single human would be enough to unravel everything the Empire had built since the ceasefire began. They were about to learn how wrong that belief truly was. The first warning came at dawn, when a perimeter guard signal went silent along the eastern tree line of the royal estate, and I was already moving before the second guard even finished shouting the alarm. 3 days had given us just enough time to prepare, though not nearly as much as I would have liked. The royal estate sat surrounded by wide gardens and old forest, beautiful in peacetime, dangerous now that it had become a battlefield waiting to happen. King Draven had quietly reinforced the estate's defenses, calling in loyal guards from across the capital, under the cover of routine honeymoon security, while keeping the true scale of the threat hidden from all but a trusted few. I had spent those 3 days training with the estate's guards, teaching them the kind of practical, brutal efficiency that years of dangerous contracts had carved into my instincts, techniques that clashed sharply with the more formal, ceremonial combat styles the Velkhari traditionally relied upon. Some of the guards resented taking instruction from a human. Most set that resentment aside once they understood what was coming. Now, as the first alarm rang out across the estate grounds, all that preparation was about to be tested. I grabbed the weapon that had been forged for me specifically after the ceremony, a blade suited to my human frame, rather than the longer, heavier weapons the Velkhari favored, and ran toward the eastern tree line, where the silence had first broken the morning calm. Ethera caught up to me before I reached the gardens, dressed not in ceremonial silks but in practical armor she had insisted on wearing despite her father's objections, a long blade of her own held steady in her hands. "You should be with your father," I said, not slowing my pace. "My father has guards enough around him," she replied, matching my stride easily. "You need someone watching your back, and I do not intend to sit inside these walls while my future is decided outside them." I did not argue further. There was no time, and some part of me, buried beneath the urgency of the moment, was grateful not to be facing what was coming alone. The tree line erupted into motion as we approached, dozens of armed figures pouring out from the shadows of the old forest, moving with the disciplined coordination of trained soldiers, rather than the desperate scramble of common raiders. Lord Saravan's coalition had not gathered simple mercenaries for this assault. They had brought a small army, one built and trained in secret over the weeks since the wedding, waiting for exactly this moment to strike. I met the first attacker with a speed that caught him off guard, deflecting his blade and countering fast enough to put him down before he could recover his balance. Beside me, Ethera moved with the fluid grace of formal Velkhari training, her longer reach and precise strikes carving space through the chaos with a different kind of efficiency than my own. The estate guards arrived moments later, clashing with the invading coalition forces across the wide gardens, the peaceful grounds that had hosted a honeymoon celebration only days earlier, now transformed into a chaotic battlefield of ringing steel and shouted commands. I fought my way forward, cutting a path toward the source of the coordinated assault, trusting Ethera to hold her own beside me as we pushed deeper into the fighting. The coalition soldiers were skilled, better trained than I expected, but they had not accounted for the kind of unpredictable, aggressive fighting style I brought to the field, a style built not from centuries of formal tradition, but from years of surviving however necessary, against whatever threat presented itself. A horn sounded from somewhere near the tree line, deep and resonant, cutting through the noise of battle. The coalition soldiers around us shifted formation immediately, falling back into a wider defensive line, creating a path through their ranks for a single figure who stepped forward from the shadows of the forest. He was tall, even for a Velkhari, dressed in dark armor, unmarked by any noble house's colors, carrying a blade longer and heavier than any I had seen among the estate's guards. His eyes found mine across the battlefield, with an intensity that told me exactly why the coalition had fallen back to let him through. "You must be the human they speak of," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the sudden pocket of relative quiet that had formed around us. "The one who broke centuries of law simply by refusing to stand still." "And you must be the guy they sent to fix that mistake," I replied. A faint, humorless smile crossed his sharp features. "I am Kael Thasari, champion of Lord Saravan's coalition. I have trained in the old ways, since before your species first learned to build ships capable of reaching the stars. Whatever instinct saved you at that wedding will not save you here." Ethera moved to stand beside me, her blade raised, but Kael's gaze shifted to her, with something that might have been respect beneath the cold calculation in his eyes. "This is not your fight, princess," he said. "Step aside, and no further harm will come to you today. This became my fight the moment your coalition decided my marriage was worth breaking through violence," she replied, her voice steady, despite the danger radiating from the warrior standing before us. "I will not step aside." Kale's eyes returned to me, weighing something behind his calm expression. "Then let us settle this the old way, human. A challenge, sworn and witnessed by both sides. If I fall, my coalition withdraws from this field, their claim against your bond broken by the old rules of honor combat. If you fall, the princess and her guards step aside, and we take the estate without further bloodshed on either side." I glanced at Euthera, who gave the smallest, most reluctant nod, understanding the calculation, even as she clearly hated it. A single combat, formally witnessed, could end this battle without the wider slaughter that continued fighting promised. It was a gamble, but the alternative was watching more lives lost, on both sides of a war that should never have restarted in the first place. "Deal," I said, stepping forward. The fighting around us slowly stilled, both sides pulling back to form a rough circle around the open ground, where Kale and I now faced each other, the morning light casting long shadows across the trampled grass between us. Euthera stood at the edge of the circle, her blade still raised, her eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that steadied something anxious in my chest. Kale moved first, his longer blade cutting through the air with a speed that belied his size, forcing me to give ground immediately as I deflected the strike and searched for an opening in his formal, precise technique. He fought like a man who had spent his entire life perfecting a single style, every movement measured and deliberate, built on centuries of tradition passed down through generations of dedicated training. I fought like a man who had spent his life surviving whatever situation presented itself, adapting on instinct, mixing aggression with unpredictability, in ways his formal training had never prepared him to counter. We traded blows across the open ground, the clash of our blades ringing out sharply in the morning air, each of us searching for weaknesses in the other's approach. Kale was strong, faster than his size suggested, and his reach gave him an advantage I had to work hard to overcome. But his precision, the very thing that made his technique so effective against traditional Velkari opponents, also made him predictable in ways I could exploit. I feinted low, drawing his blade downward to block a strike that never fully landed, then twisted sideways and drove my shoulder into his chest, breaking his balance just enough to open a gap in his defense. He recovered quickly, faster than I expected, and countered with a strike that caught my arm, drawing a line of pain across muscle that I forced myself to ignore. The fight stretched on, longer than either of us anticipated, both sides watching in tense silence as we traded ground back and forth across the trampled circle. I could feel exhaustion beginning to pull at my limbs, the earlier fighting through the gardens having already drained more strength than I wanted to admit, but I forced myself to keep moving, keep adapting, keep searching for the opening that would decide this fight. Kale pressed his advantage, driving a series of fast, precise strikes that forced me backward toward the edge of the circle, his confidence growing with every step he gained. I read the pattern in his movements, the slight predictability hidden beneath his impressive skill, and waited for the exact moment his weight shifted too far forward, committed too fully to the strike he believed would finally end the fight. When that moment came, I did not retreat. I stepped inside his reach instead, closing the distance his longer blade was built to control, and drove my shoulder into his chest a second time, while my blade swept upward, catching his weapon and forcing it wide. For a single, suspended moment, Kale stood open and unbalanced, his formal training offering no answer for an opponent who refused to fight at the distance his weapon demanded. I did not hesitate. The fight ended a moment later, and Kale fell to one knee, his blade knocked from his grip, my own weapon held steady at his throat. The circle around us fell utterly silent, hundreds of soldiers on both sides watching the outcome that would decide whether this battle continued or ended here, in the trampled grass of a garden that had hosted a wedding celebration only weeks before. Kale looked up at me, breathing hard, something like grudging respect settling into his sharp features despite the sting of defeat. "You fight like nothing our traditions ever prepared us for." "Good," I said, lowering my blade slightly, though not fully. "Maybe your traditions needed the reminder that the galaxy's bigger than your empire's old rules." He rose slowly, honoring the terms of the challenge without argument, and turned to face the coalition forces still gathered at the tree line. "The challenge is settled," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet battlefield. "We withdraw, as sworn." A tense murmur rippled through the coalition ranks, but discipline held, and slowly, reluctantly, the invading forces began retreating back into the forest from which they had emerged, their assault broken not by overwhelming force, but by the old rules of honor their own culture had built centuries before humanity ever arrived among the stars. I lowered my blade fully, exhaustion finally catching up with me as the adrenaline of the fight began to fade. Ethera reached my side quickly, her hand steadying my arm as the strength in my legs threatened to give out beneath the weight of everything the last few minutes had demanded. "You held," she said softly, relief evident beneath the careful composure she still maintained in front of the watching soldiers. "Told you I would," I managed, my voice rough with exhaustion. Word of the battle spread quickly through the Empire in the days that followed, carried not just through official reports, but through the accounts of soldiers on both sides who had witnessed a single human warrior stand against Lord Saravan's champion and end a battle that could have cost thousands of lives. Lord Saravan himself was arrested within the week, the coalition's plans exposed fully once his forces withdrew, and his allies began turning against each other, rather than face the consequences alone. The empire that emerged from those events was different from the one I had first walked into, as an overlooked guard, escorting cargo through unfamiliar space. Humans were no longer dismissed as a curiosity, a minor species unworthy of serious consideration among the galaxy's older powers. Word of what happened at the royal estate spread far beyond Velkari borders, carried by merchants and diplomats and soldiers, who had witnessed history change in the span of a single morning battle. King Draven summoned me to his private chambers one final time, weeks after the battle had ended, the Empire finally settling back into a fragile but genuine peace. Ethera stood beside him, and for the first time since I had known her, her expression carried none of the careful, formal distance that had once defined her royal bearing. "You never asked for the bond that brought you here," the king said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude rather than simple formal courtesy. "Yet you carried it further than any shield sworn in our history, further than I ever expected when I invoked that ancient law in a moment of shock and fear." "Wasn't exactly planning on any of this when I took that cargo job," I admitted. "And yet here you stand," he said, "having changed how an entire empire views your species, having ended a war before it truly began, having proven that courage is not bound by bloodline or tradition, but by choice." I looked between the king and his daughter, feeling the full weight of everything that had happened since I first stepped through those palace doors, settle into something I could finally understand. I had not asked for this life, bound by ancient law to a throne I had never sought, carrying a title I had never wanted. But standing here now, having faced down assassins and armies and everything the Empire's old traditions had thrown against me, I understood that some burdens, however unwanted, become the very things that define who you are. Ethera stepped forward, her silver eyes meeting mine, with a warmth that had grown steadily since that first chaotic day in the healing chamber. "Whatever comes next for this empire," she said quietly, "I am glad it comes with you standing beside it." I did not have a perfect answer for that, not yet, but I found myself smiling, despite the exhaustion and scars the last few months had left behind. Whatever the future held for the Velkari Empire, whatever challenges still waited beyond its borders, I understood now that I would face them, not as an outsider passing through, but as something the Empire's old laws had never quite prepared for. A human, bound by ancient oath, standing where history had never expected humanity to stand at all.